They told him to stay quiet, to lower his eyes, to accept things the way they were. He was warned not to resist, not to question, not to stand when everyone else bowed. But he refused, not out of arrogance, but out of principle. And for that, the system turned on him. They tried to humiliate him, isolate him, crush him from every direction. But no matter how hard they pushed, he didn't break. Because he wasn't fighting for power. He was fighting for dignity. And, in the end, they didn't silence him. He exposed them. He was never the one to draw attention. But when he entered a room, there was a quiet steadiness about him that people couldn't ignore. He didn't speak often, but when he did, every word was chosen, grounded, and intentional. For years, he followed the system without protest. He respected authority, honored rules, and trusted that fairness was something built into the structure. But over time, the cracks began to show. Subtle at first, certain voices being dismissed in meetings, certain names never making it onto lists for opportunity, expectations quietly shifting depending on who was involved. He noticed patterns others chose to ignore. Promotions passed. Over, policies bent in favor of the connected, silence rewarded while honesty was punished. What others called just the way things are, he recognized as something deeper, something wrong. And though it would have been easier to blend in, to let it go, to nod along for the sake of survival, he couldn't. Something inside him refused to agree with what didn't sit right. So he asked questions, not to challenge, but to understand. He asked why certain rules applied to some but not others. Why good work was overlooked when done by the wrong person. Why justice seemed to depend on convenience. But the system didn't like questions it couldn't answer. It was built on quiet, compliance, not active awareness, and so the more he asked, the more they labeled him. Not as dangerous, but as difficult. Not as dishonest, but as disloyal. He wasn't loud, he wasn't reckless, but his insistence on truth made people uncomfortable, especially those who had benefited from avoiding it. Slowly, doors that once opened with ease began to close. Invitations stopped. Praise turned into polite tolerance. He became the one they warned others not to be. Too bold, too curious, too unwilling to play along. But he didn't stop. Not because he enjoyed the fight, but because pretending not to see had never been an option for him. While others prioritized survival, he prioritized integrity. He had no plan to rebel, no desire to lead a revolution. He simply refused to bow to rules that bent against the very fairness they claimed to represent. That quiet refusal made him a threat, not to the people, but to the illusion the system had worked so hard to protect. And once he was seen as a threat, it was only a matter of time before the system began to push back. Not loudly, not publicly, but in ways designed to wear him down, to isolate him, to remind him that standing tall comes at a cost. But what they didn't realize was that he had already accepted the cost. He wasn't trying to win. He was trying not to lose himself. They couldn't discredit his work, so they went after everything else. His results spoke for themselves. Accurate, consistent, and built on discipline that was difficult to attack directly. So they shifted their strategy. They whispered behind closed doors, planting doubt in places he couldn't reach. They questioned his tone, his attitude, his loyalty. Not openly, but subtly, enough to stain his reputation without having to prove anything. He began to notice changes. Emails stopped arriving. Projects he once led were handed quietly to others with less experience. But more compliance. He was transferred to smaller roles, sidelined into tasks that didn't match his skill, placed under supervisors who barely knew what he was capable of. There was no explanation, no written reprimand, just a quiet erosion of trust designed to push him toward resignation. What they couldn't challenge with facts they tried to crush with isolation, but instead of breaking, he became sharper. Every act of pettiness confirmed what he already knew. He was being punished not for doing wrong, but for refusing to look away when wrong was being done. And the more they pushed, the more determined he became. He began to document everything. He saved messages, took notes after meetings, created a paper trail where none had existed before. What they thought was passive compliance was careful preparation. He didn't lash out. He didn't retaliate with drama. He remained calm, collected, and dangerously observant. While they tried to silence him with confusion and chaos, he responded with quiet clarity. Every small injustice became a piece of something bigger. Every lie told about him revealed more about them. And while they waited for him to shrink, to ask for forgiveness, to fold into the shape they preferred, he stood even more firmly in his place. He had nothing to apologize for. His record was clean. His motives were intact. What he wanted wasn't revenge or pity. It was accountability. That made him a different kind of threat. Not loud enough to dismiss, not wrong enough to punish, not weak enough to break. They had created a wall of manipulation, but he wasn't trying to climb it. He was quietly building something stronger behind it. They couldn't see it yet, but every effort to push him out was pushing him deeper into purpose. And while they played the same old games to maintain control, he was playing a longer game, one rooted in principle, one built on truth. They underestimated how dangerous integrity can be in the hands of someone who refuses to let it go. And soon they would learn that even quiet resistance can shake foundations. He had learned enough about the system to know that waiting for fairness rarely worked. So he stopped waiting. He gathered every email, every ignored request, every record of mistreatment and contradiction. He built timelines, printed policies, highlighted double standards. He didn't do it for revenge. He did it for the truth. At first, it was just for himself, just to stay sane in the face of gaslighting and quiet sabotage. But as he collected the evidence, he saw something larger. This wasn't just about him. The tactics used against him had names, patterns, histories. They had been used before on others who didn't fight back, who didn't have the strength or resources or confidence to stand up. He realized he wasn't alone. He was simply one of the few who hadn't been broken by it. That realization shifted everything. What began as self-preservation became something deeper. He filed a formal complaint. When it was buried, he appealed. When the door was shut, he found another. He submitted reports to oversight boards, external agencies, ethics committees. Every time they tried to delay him with paperwork, he responded with precision. Every time they tried to confuse him, he answered with clarity. He spoke with facts, not emotion. He followed the rules better than they ever had. And slowly, his case became impossible to ignore. Whispers turned into questions. Colleagues who had once kept their distance began to reach out, quietly, carefully, sharing their own stories, their own fears, their own frustrations. What started as a personal defense was becoming a collective awakening. Some of them had given up. Some had never dared to speak. But in him they saw possibility, not because he was louder or more powerful, but because he was relentless. And the truth he carried didn't come with a price tag or an agenda. It came from lived experience. As more eyes turned toward the evidence he had collected, the system began to shift, not willingly, but nervously. Those in charge tried to discredit him again, this time with new tactics, more sophisticated forms of control. But it was too late. The documentation was clean. The contradictions were exposed. The walls they had built to protect themselves now echoed with doubt. He hadn't made noise for attention. He had cut through the silence with truth. And the system, so sure of its control, now found itself on the defensive. People who once dismissed him were now watching him closely. Not out of curiosity, but out of concern. He had become something they didn't know how to contain. Not a rebel, not a victim, but a force of accountability that moved with quiet purpose and undeniable proof There came a point when even the most carefully hidden lies couldn't hold. The evidence he had gathered, once dismissed as irrelevant or exaggerated, now sat in front of decision-makers who could no longer pretend not to see. The facts were clear, the timelines consistent, the contradictions undeniable. Internal investigations that were once slow and controlled took on new urgency as external scrutiny followed. What had started as whispers became formal inquiries. Names were named. Dates were matched. Official records began to collapse under the weight of documents that should have never existed, or should have been dealt with long ago. The system, once so confident in its ability to protect itself, started showing signs of fracture. Senior figures who had once dismissed him behind closed doors stepped aside under pressure. Policies that had operated in the shadows were rewritten, or removed entirely. Procedures once used to intimidate and silence were suddenly under review. But through it all, he never raised his voice. He didn't celebrate the resignations or gloat over the shifting tides. That was never the goal. His purpose had never been to tear anyone down. It had been to lift something up. The standard of truth, the expectation of fairness, the basic dignity owed to every person, regardless of their position or silence. While others had sought status or self-preservation, he had simply refused to look away. And now, the very system that once tried to bend him was being forced to bend towards something better. Those who had once held power without question now spoke his name with caution, if at all. Some did so with quiet respect, others with nervous calculation. Because they understood now, he wasn't just one person with a grievance. He had become a reminder. A reminder that ignoring injustice doesn't erase it, that silence isn't protection when truth has proof behind it, and that integrity, when held long enough and tight enough, can outlast even the most sophisticated machinery built. To suppress it, he didn't need revenge, he didn't crave headlines. The shift in the system, the recognition of what had gone wrong, and the quiet corrections that followed, that was the only vindication he needed. He had exposed not just corruption, but vulnerability. He had revealed that beneath the polished surface of authority was fear. Fear of being seen, of being held accountable, of being confronted by someone who refused to play the game. And the most remarkable part of it all was that he had done it without shouting, without backing down, and without ever bowing. Not once. He didn't ask for recognition, but it found him in unexpected ways. People who once avoided his name began mentioning him with quiet respect. Those who had stayed silent during his struggle now pointed to him when they spoke of courage. New employees entered the system knowing his story, not through official memos, but through whispered admiration, the tale of the one who didn't bow, the one who faced pressure and stood taller. He never claimed to be a leader, yet others followed. Not in protest, but in principle. His actions planted seeds in the minds of those who had once felt powerless. They started asking questions where they once stayed silent. They documented where they once deleted. They stood where they once bent. Not because they wanted to fight, but because he had proven it was possible to push back and remain whole. What he endured became a reference point for others, a reminder that integrity, when paired with resilience, can shake even the most rigid foundations. He wasn't made of stone. He had known doubt, fear, and exhaustion, but he had kept going, not out of stubbornness alone, but because he understood something others forgot. Dignity isn't given, it's claimed. And he claimed his not by demanding power, but by refusing to surrender it. Long after the headlines faded, after the policies changed and the officials were replaced, his presence remained. It echoed in every decision made with greater fairness. It lingered in every hesitation to repeat old patterns. It lived in the spaces where silence had once ruled. He never wore a crown. He never asked for applause. But his spine, unyielding, honest, unwavering, became a standard others measured themselves against. The system had tried to bury him in paperwork, in procedure, in pressure. It had tried to paint him as difficult, to push him toward defeat, but instead, it revealed him. It forced the spotlight on a truth it could no longer escape. And that truth was this: real strength is quiet. It doesn't seek revenge. It doesn't collapse under threat. It endures, it observes, and when the time is right, it speaks in ways that can't be denied. His legacy wasn't built in a courtroom or a headline. It was built in the thousands of small, defiant choices to remain standing when every force demanded that he bow. And in doing so, he didn't just protect his own name. He reminded everyone watching that one person, armed with nothing but the refusal to give in, can hold the line for many more to follow.